Hi, AP Psych friends. Welcome to Unit 10 in your textbook on personality. This is going to be part 1 on psychoanalysis. So you get to meet the wonderful world of Sigmund Freud. And so I love your textbook author's analogy, and that Freud is to psychology what Elvis is to rock and roll, right? So even if you're not into him, even if you have no idea what his theories are, you've still heard of him. And so he is a very influential person in the history of psychology. And we'll discuss the critique and criticism at the end of this slideshow, although there are obviously components of Freud's theory that modern day psychology does not subscribe to. His theory has infiltrated pop culture, popular psychology, television, movies, songs, literature, and so he is at least worth knowing, even though there's not a lot of emphasis on it in modern day times. Let's talk about the mind structure. This is crucial to understanding psychoanalysis. And this is a little bit of review from Unit 5. Okay, remember that we have what's known as our unconscious, which is, information or thinking that's occurring in our mind of which we are unaware. And Freud said that usually consisted of unacceptable feelings or urges. That's one of the things that's critiqued about his theory today, but nevertheless, that's what he believed. We have the conscious part of our mind. That's the part of our mind that we're aware of. And then we have this cool middle ground, right? The preconscious mind, which is outside of our awareness, but nevertheless accessible, right? And so Freud's big contribution to the field of psych was in how he began to study this. And so he used a technique known as free association. And so the stereotypical view of a psychologist or a therapist office, right, with the long leather couch and a person sitting and talking about their thoughts and feelings while a therapist listens, comes from Freud. And so free association involves the individual relaxing and just saying whatever comes to mind. And then the therapist can follow the chain of thought back to whatever the unconscious motive happens to be. And so I guess that leads us to the official definition of psychoanalysis, right? This is Freud's theory of personality that attributes thoughts and actions to unconscious motives and conflicts. Again, that will get adapted and changed by modern day psychologists, but this is, one explanation of personality. And so our personality is structured in 3 components, according to Freud: id, superego, and ego. Okay, id is the part of your personality that works on basic drives and the pleasure principle, right? The id is the part that we're all born with, and represented in the wonderful clip art there by the little devil child. Your superego is the part that represents good thought and judgment, and it's actually acquired through socialization and is going to work on what Freud called the moral principle. So that is represented there by the little angel clip art. And then you have the largely conscious part of your personality, right? Or the executive part of your personality, known as the ego. And that is the part of your personality that is going to mediate between the demands of the id and the moral warnings of the superego. Your ego is working on what Freud called the reality principle. And so that is represented there by the scales, right? Balancing the drive, the basic drive of the id, working on the pleasure principle, and the warnings of the moral principle of the superego. The little graphic there on the right hand side that kind of puts it all together, right? The different levels of our mind followed by our personality structure. So the analogy that Freud always used was that our mind is like an iceberg, and really there's only a small portion of our personality that is revealed, consciously to the world, and the rest is lying below the surface. So you can see that visual there to help you out. Okay, and so moving on here, how did one acquire their personality? Okay, Freud believed that your personality developed through a series of stages in childhood. The stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. We will kind of go through some examples of these in class. For purposes of the AP exam, it's usually if you understand oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital just as by definition and can associate them all with Freud's theory of personality development, you're fine. Remember that modern day psychology doesn't really rely on the psychoanalytic approach in its original form, but it's still nevertheless so many things in our culture have been influenced that it I guess just behooves you as a human to kind of have this basic understanding of Freud's theory, just so that you're culturally literate, so to speak. So we'll do more examples of personality development in class with the different stages. I'll give you an example of each stage so that you can kind of see. But the basic principle is this, that each stage in childhood represented some major life event or major conflict, and how that conflict was dealt with is going to affect who you end up being as an adult, right? And so personality components or personality quirks that we have as an adult, Freud said that could be traced back to conflicts that occurred at any one of those four stages. There weren't conflicts in the latency stage, but again, we will get to that in class. Okay, defense mechanisms. You learned about these in the 40 Studies book. Remember the Anna Freud article? Defense mechanisms, remember, are just ways that your ego deals with the anxiety of having to always be the mediator or the decision maker element of your personality. And so when decisions are made that cause anxiety or uneasy feelings, the ego may rely on one of these defense mechanisms to, ease those conscious feelings of uneasiness. And so we'll review these again in class, but just remember, right, that repression is the grandpappy of all defense mechanisms, right? This concept that when bad or uneasy anxiety-provoking ideas exist or memories exist, that Freud believed we could push them out of conscious thought into the unconscious realm, like pushing them below the surface. So Freud really thought that things that are too painful, too traumatic to deal with could actually be forgotten on purpose, so to speak. Again, that's probably one of the things that is most critiqued by modern day neuroscience, but all in good time. We'll get to the critique later. So there were lots of followers of Freud, and we would label those individuals as neo-Freudians. 3 of the biggest ones are listed there for you. They're all going to subscribe to the crux of Freud's theory, but have their own kind of adaptations or spin to it. Alfred Adler and Karen Horney are both going to subscribe to Freud's concept of unconscious motives. Right, they're still psychoanalytic theorists, and they're still going to buy into the fact that it's childhood experiences that make us into the adult personalities we are today. But they're both going to disagree with Freud that it's this whole sexual tensions being crucial for our personality development, and they're both going to focus more on the social element of childhood. Adler's claim to fame are this concept of the inferiority complex, that in our social interactions in childhood, we were kind of always trying to, prove ourselves or gain the attention of adults and overcome these feelings of inferiority. He was really big into the interaction between you and your first peer group, which would have been your siblings if you have any, and how your interactions with your siblings actually played a role in your personality development. Karen Horney thought that, a lot of the same things as Adler. Her main contributions are her critique of the sexist view of Freud's theory. Freud's theory is very sexist and she did a lot to, shed light on the female mind, that it's not fragile and weak and susceptible to neuroticism as willingly as Freud thought. And she also, her other big contribution is in explaining that love and affection in adulthood can actually help overcome problems that were acquired during childhood. Whereas Freud kind of thought, oh, yeah, you're messed up in adulthood because of something that happened in childhood. And she kind of viewed personality as being more fluid, that it wasn't something that was completely set by adulthood and that you couldn't change elements of it. You couldn't compensate for problems of childhood. She thought, oh, that's not true. You can overcome those problems. Okay, Carl Jung, BFFs with Freud, well, until he tried to change the theory of psychoanalysis, and then they were no longer BFFs, sadly. But Jung always struggled with the lack of, I guess, spirituality or religion that exists in psychoanalysis. And so Jung's big contribution to psychoanalytic theory is this concept of the collective unconscious, that there may, according to Jung, be thoughts and feelings that are shared by all of humanity. Like an example of, he was really big into archetypes as being part of the collective unconscious. And so if you've ever done any literary criticism in English class using using psychoanalysis, you've probably talked about archetypes, right? Like the mother as the nurturer, right? Like Mother Earth. Jung would say most cultures refer to, Earth as female or nature as female due to like the nurturing nature of this. That's kind of one of those examples of the collective unconscious or thoughts that we all share as being part of humanity. Okay, so those are some more modern, well, not really modern in that many of those people were Freud's contemporaries, but changes to psychoanalysis that are important to know. Okay, so how do we assess unconscious processes? How do you get into the unconscious of a patient if you were a therapist? We use projective tests. So there's two more things from 40 studies coming back to visit you, right? Remember the Rorschach ink blot tests? There's a little picture of one at the top. And the thematic apperception test from Murray. There's a picture of one of those at the bottom, right? And that in either type, the therapist is going to ask the person to explain the picture, whether it be the, kind of abstract ink blot, or whether it's to tell a story about the picture in the TAT, and that will allow the therapist to follow it back to the thought, to follow the answer to the test back to the unconscious motive or the unconscious process that helped the person arrive at their answer. Obviously, these critics of these types of tests argue that it's not really scientifically reliable. A lot of people critique that, stable, typical people can score high in neuroticism on these tests. But therapists today, even if they don't subscribe to psychoanalysis, may still use either the Rorschach or the TAT just as a good icebreaker activity, as a way to kind of get to know an individual. So, psychoanalytic theorists will refute these criticisms by saying, look, psychoanalysis was never intended to be a scientific theory. So yeah, we will acknowledge that they may not apply to all people in all instances, like, concerning the reliability of the tests. All right, so in evaluating psychoanalysis, again, it's not something that's really used today. The more modern view is called psychodynamic theory. Those therapists still believe in talking to the patient. They still believe in unconscious motives. They still believe in childhood experiences affecting our personality. Don't necessarily believe in the sexual aggressive tensions that Freud subscribed to. So bring any questions you have to class about Freud. I'm sure there's a lot. And as always, thanks for listening.